Welcome everyone. My name is Susan Elliott, and I am the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. We're very pleased today to talk about what I think is an extremely interesting and important topic, which is conducting elections in the time of a pandemic. And we have two very distinguished people who will guide the dialogue. First, many of you already know, but Susan Thornton, who's the director of our Forum on Asia Pacific Security, will be the moderator and will discuss this issue with our panelist, John Delury. And as for those of you who don't know Susan, she recently started as the director of our FAPS programs in January of 2020, but she had a very distinguished career at the U.S. Department of State, ending up as the acting assistant secretary of state for the Bureau of East Asia and Pacific Affairs. She also was the principal deputy assistant secretary of state in that bureau and served in a variety of places overseas, including Beijing. And she served as deputy chief of mission in Turkmenistan. She served in Moscow, in Russia. She served in Armenia. So she has a wide background, not just in Asia, but and I think her original studies were in Soviet affairs. And she's fluent in Russian and Mandarin Chinese. So we are very, very fortunate to have her running our FAPS program. But our speaker today is John Delury, and he's a professor of Chinese studies at the Yonsei University Graduate Program of International Studies, which is located in Korea. And he serves also as the chair of the master's program in international cooperation. And he's the program in the undergraduate program, the chair of the international studies at Yonsei's Underwood International College. He's the author of the book Wealth and Power, China's Long March to the 21st Century, published by Random House. And he's currently working on another book about US-China relations in the early Cold War. One of the reasons we asked John to speak today, and I hope many of you got to read the article that he wrote in the New York Times about how the Republic of Korea were successfully able to conduct their elections during a pandemic. And so we're very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts and comments on that. But the one thing that I will say, John is a National Committee on American Foreign Policy 21st Century leader. He's one of the Leaders Council, and but he also is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and the National Committee on North Korea. So we have a lot to discuss today, so I'm going to stop talking now and turn the program over to Susan. And thanks to you both, especially to John, because he's coming to us from Seoul, Korea, which I think it's about 11 p.m. there. So thank you, John, for spending your late evening with us. And I'll turn it over to Susan.
Great. Thank you, Susan. Thank you very much, John. You're looking remarkably fresh for this late night start. And thanks to all of our attendees today for this coming out this morning for this fascinating program. I think we certainly want to hear from John, but it's just strikes me that it seems so long ago now that we were looking at South Korea coming at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. They had a lot of cases. It looked like there was going to be a big outbreak in South Korea. People were very concerned. And then all of a sudden, you know, things turned around very sharply. People have been talking about, you know, how democracies are handling the COVID-19 response. And then in the middle of all of this, South Korea mounted a huge effort to conduct their National Assembly elections, a nationwide election, as long ago as April, which, you know, was really right in the middle of things and when cases were starting to ramp up in the US. So we're super pleased to have you with us, John. And please, if you wouldn't mind just sort of painting the picture of what happened and what your takeaways are from this really astonishing kind of turnaround that we saw in South Korea.
Okay, well, great. Thank you to both Susans. I'm delighted to join you and the rest of, I see some familiar names on the call and great friends from New York and members of the National Committee. You know, quickly, I just have to say I feel so indebted to the National Committee, who sort of believed in me when I was right out of the PhD, and George and Don, you know, and John Connorton and the whole crew, and Edie. So I'm really thrilled, you know, 10 plus years later to be back in this capacity now that I'm over here in Korea. You know, Susan, this piece I wrote for the New York Times, I'm not sure I even mentioned it in the op-ed, but I really did write it at that point already with November in mind. You know, and these days talking with my family, folks in Sacramento, California, talking with friends there in New York or Baltimore area, you know, November comes up a lot. And I hear a real concern in their voices, in their analysis of the situation, you know, about what could happen and about some real kind of nightmare scenarios for US democracy this fall. If I was thinking about it, we already had a polarized electorate, a very narrow margin of victory in 2016, controversies over voting rights in many states across the country, fake news, conspiracy theorizing, foreign disinformation campaigns, and, you know, I don't want to get too political here, but maybe a relatively blasé commitment to the Constitution on the part of the incumbent. We could debate that. Even if you take that one away, think of that list already. And on top of that, a pandemic. So I do think that, you know, as a US citizen and the Americans I talk to, there's this deep concern. And that's where I do think that looking at Korea, at what they did, and also why that election happened the way it did in April, is a conversation really worth happening. Just to remind everyone, as you mentioned, Susan, you know, at that point in mid-April, things, you know, South Korea, I guess I would describe it as still flattening the curve. It was not clear that it was going to get down to a really low level as it has. So there was a real sense of risk. Korea was not out of the woods. And I think internationally, if Korea had said they're putting off that election, no one would have, you know, batted an eye. So it tells us something, I think, very important about the fact that, you know, really it wasn't even an option not to have the election. And in fact, as you mentioned, it turned out to be one of the highest voter turnouts in decades for a South Korean election. And why is that? There's a technical side to it, which we can talk about a little bit. The National Election Commission here going, you know, overboard in all ways to ensure that it was going to be safe for voters to get to their polling booths or to get their votes in, that the election would be perceived as safe, so that voters would feel comfortable. And then, you know, later we know it was safe because there was no spike 2 weeks or 3 weeks out afterwards, even though close to 30 million people gathered in public spaces. Mostly it was in-person voting. There was no infection spike from that. So they took extraordinary measures to make sure that it would happen. And, you know, I think the reason that occurred is the South Korean public's expectations, you know, the demands on the government made it inconceivable that they wouldn't put it together. And this is where, and I'd love to hear your reflections on this and maybe others on the call. You know, I have to say I've spent 10 years now in South Korea, and one of the sort of sociological differences that I've seen in our two societies, and it's one I actually see the gap getting bigger and bigger, is I'm struck by sort of two things about South Korea. One is the sort of across the board value of public everything. You know, public is a good word here, and a huge amount of resources are put into public. So that we're seeing that most obviously with the public health response to a public health crisis, where there's a well-resourced public health sector that kicks in here with experts who know how to respond and are empowered to respond. But you also see it in public education, where most people, affluent families, send their kids to the public schools. You see it in public infrastructure and transportation. You know, if you take a bus, if you take the subway in Seoul, it's clean, it's efficient, and it's affordable, it's cheap. You see it, again, this links back to the response to COVID. You see it in the public IT, the public information infrastructure, which is, you know, on the one hand, there's good Wi-Fi kind of everywhere, but it's more than that. It's that you have public institutions to manage information in the public sphere, and that's who's doing the contact tracing. And so, you know, Koreans, no one likes to have their privacy invaded, but one of the reasons that South Koreans have been able to do the kind of contact tracing that they do is there's a public information infrastructure where citizens are turning their information over to public entities, you know, the public health sector, who uses that information for epidemiological purposes and then gets rid of it. And people are comfortable with that because the whole thing is done in the public sphere. And, you know, you go down the line and you think about how all of those issues play out in the United States, where the trust in the public, everything has been crumbling, and the resources from public health, public education down the line have been steadily depleted and decreasing. You know, it was actually I was really blown away a couple of days ago when a US embassy, and you of all people would appreciate this, someone from the US embassy made an off the record but public statement at a conference that I was a part of, and described, you know, there was no attempt to put lipstick on the pig of what's going on in the United States. And the kind of thesis of this presentation was COVID has brought out the best, the strengths of South Korea, and the worst weaknesses of the United States. And it was frankly stunning to hear that from a US diplomat. And they did it in a very diplomatic way that was quite compelling. It made you like America more for facing up to it. But it was also kind of wrenching to hear it. I think accurate, but wrenching. So yeah, I'm a professor. We got to stop me here because I'll just keep going for 50 minutes. So let me try to wind this down, and we can circle back.
Your takeaways for all of us would be great.
So I think the key thing is this issue of public, right? The ultimate, we live in democracies, but also republics. I mean, the ROK is the Republic of Korea. The United States, as we know from Hamilton, is set up as a republic. Republic literally means the public thing. And the ultimate way in which we act as democracies, as republics, is through our elections. So in the Korean case in April, or the planning for the April election was happening really in some of the worst periods when they were being hit by COVID, and were kind of the second epicenter, along with Iran and Italy, outside of China. They had to do it. You know, the public expectations of holding a safe election were so high that they had to carry it through. And then they had the technical, you know, they took the technical steps to do it. So I think it's in those two aspects that there's something for Americans to learn from South Korea, or in a way be inspired by South Korea. And that's why I wrote the op-ed, is to kind of put a marker down to say the American public has to hold that expectation and not sort of give in to a kind of fatalism that we can't do this stuff, that it's inevitable, that the election will have you know, flaws to the point where its legitimacy could be questioned, or states could call off the election if there's a second wave. I mean, these are the kind of scenarios I think we can't imagine. And I think what South Korea can help with Americans to do is to say, no, that is absolutely unacceptable. We have to have a safe election. And that's at the kind of philosophical level. And then at the technical level, how do you pull that off? And let me just add one specific thing. Well, first of all, the State Department has been facilitating some of this learning, which is great to know, so that secretaries of state who are in charge at the state level of the elections have had at least one, and hopefully there's been follow-up session with the Korean National Election Commission to be briefed specifically on the steps that they took to make it a safe election. And there's one in particular that actually I didn't pay much attention to at the time. It wasn't on my mind at the time of writing that piece right after the election. But as I've been looking back at that material preparing for tonight, they went out of their way to make it possible for COVID patients to vote. Now, you know, they were that was statistically negligible. Yeah. It was a tiny group of people. It was in the hundreds. They made it possible for cases, even severe cases of COVID, they made it possible to vote from the hospital setting. And then those under a kind of self-quarantine, they made a special after-hour safe polling space, safe also for the people working at the polling space. So that, wow, when we think about November, how many COVID patients are there going to be in the electorate? Or how many people who should maybe assume that they have COVID, you know, wherever the US is with its testing. And when you think, in addition to that, that so far COVID is disproportionately affecting, you know, people of color, working class, essential services, essentially the same people that historically are disenfranchised in the vote. You know, there's a likelihood, a large, statistically significant percentage of that population will have COVID at the time of the election. And so how to ensure that there is a safe way for COVID patients to vote is something that the Koreans really paid attention to and worked on. And so at that kind of specific technical level, I think a lot could still be learned, you know, by Americans. All right, let me stop
great.
there.
Yeah, no, I mean, thanks so much for that, John. So many interesting parallels, observations, and things for us to keep in mind, not just for the US election, but as we watch what unfolds with COVID in other democracies around the world. I think there's a lot of things that you raised that will be relevant in other places as well. So let me, if you don't mind, dig down in a couple of aspects that you mentioned or alluded to. First of all, you mentioned at the top, and Susan also mentioned, that the turnout in this election, given everything, you might understand that the turnout might not be, you know, that robust, that people would be worried, afraid, stay away. What explains in your mind the dramatic turnout number, which was the highest, you know, turnout in decades, especially for a National Assembly election? I mean, it's not, I mean, you know, US midterm elections, you know, we're lucky to get a pretty meager turnout. So is there something about people having been, you know, locked down under COVID that made them want to show up? What is in your mind the thing that explains the dramatic increase in turnout, really?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's part of it, if not sort of release from cabin fever, like here's something I have to do, an outdoor activity. But I do think, and in talking to some people, I mean, I don't have a statistical basis for this, but anecdotally, there was something about making the point that we will vote, you know, because if you looked at the issues, it wasn't like, I mean, North Korea, as you know, is never the big domestic issue that people would assume from the outside. But there was nothing in play, really, as far as North Korea is concerned. You know, the only real hot issue at that point was COVID itself. I think that, you know, the parties, actually, both of them are pretty unpopular. The president was fairly popular at that point, but he's essentially a lame duck since it's a one term and it's the National Assembly election. So the point is, there was not that kind of draw. There wasn't a hot issue or personality that explains it. And I think in the absence of that, it goes back to this point that people wanted to show they could vote, and they trusted the National Election Commission, which put a lot of effort. Again, the perception was so important. They not only did the work to prepare it so that it'd be safe, they worked very, very hard to create the perception that it would be safe. And so people, while the whole thing felt risky, the actual process of going to the polling place was so well organized, and they have been told in so many ways this is going to be safe, that I don't think people felt they were personally taking a risk. My wife is a Korean citizen. We've got little kids. She would not have risked her personal safety of that of our family, but she had the trust in the public institution, essentially, of the voting itself, that all steps have been taken to ensure that it was really not a risk. And so it was kind of a combination of those things. People wanted to affirm their democracy in really what was a test for it. Will people go out and vote even though there's a pandemic? And also they had confidence that it had been done responsibly, and it was safe to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, it's just such an interesting case because, I mean, there was a lot of partisanship and divide, even though you say both of the parties are unpopular, but there are strong divisions within the electorate, or there had been, leading up to this election. And yet, it seems that the COVID-19 handling really gave a boost to President Moon's party. Mm-hmm. Is there anything about the domestic political situation that you think might have made some of these trends more apparent this year? Or is there anything about, you mentioned trust in the institutions, which might, I guess, have trumped any particular partisan divides that would have inhibited sort of unfolding of a smooth election? But I guess the question about technology and the public education and the trust in the institutions kind of overwhelming whatever mistrust might have been spurred by the partisanship is something that I'm a little bit surprised by in this case. And I wonder if you have any observations about that. Were there demographic trends in the turnout of the election that would indicate something about the relationship between the sort of deep partisan divides and the trust in institutions and in the government to run a good election?
The best, it's another great question. It's a complicated one, and some of it falls outside, I think, of my knowledge. But speculating a little bit here, I think that part of it, I'm painting a very glowing picture of the Korean model and experience. But as you know, it is certainly a very partisan political culture. Some of that is, you can say, is liberal conservative. Some of it is really essentially factional, and regional, and networks battling it out for the goodies. And so I think if we forget about COVID for a second, for various reasons, the Conservative Party, well, essentially they never recovered from the spectacular implosion, the impeachment, which is kind of relevant to all this, but the mass demonstrations against the conservative predecessor Park Geun-hye and her impeachment, and the Conservative Party went down so hard with Park Geun-hye, and it's taken years, and they have not yet recovered, and so they hadn't recovered going into that election, and so that has given Moon and the ruling party, it's given them a lot of room. And what I would say, what he was so effective at doing, and again, there's a lot of unstated contrasts here with the situations in the United States, but another huge contrast between, say, the way President Moon and President Trump have handled things is, President Moon got out of the way very early in terms of the handling of COVID. So again, in terms of the public, what we saw every day, twice a day, was the director of the KCDC. And then we would also hear from, the minister or vice minister of public health. And so all the messaging, it would be like if you only heard in America from Fauci and everyone agreed, if there's a question about COVID, you just say, Dr. Fauci, do you want to handle that? You know, that's been how the messaging has been handled, and also a lot of the decision making, you know, has been, what do our public health people say? And then we got to make that work in terms of the economy, in terms of school reopenings and all of these things. That's a political decision. You know, President Moon primarily made that political decision that the public health experts were in charge, and the public was going to see that they're in charge. And then the public sent a message with that election. That's what we want. That's what we like, you know? And so his party got very lucky in a way. They weren't necessarily fond of the party, but it was widely interpreted, I think correctly interpreted, as an election about the handling of COVID. And it was Moon's letting the experts take the lead, that the majority of the electorate, whether they're conservative or liberal, whether they're from, you know, the Southwest or the Southeast, there was a strong, young or old, there was a consensus. We want that. We like that. We approve that. And so that, you know, that went to the ruling party.
So many good parallels and good questions to ask, really, and sort of think deeply about what the takeaways are. But one, you know, there are a lot of dissimilarities, of course, too, between Korea and the United States. And we have a question in from Ken Creary that gets to another thing that I wanted to ask about. He makes the point that, of course, Korea has a national election commission, and there is no equivalent in the US. We have, you know, state secretaries of state, as you mentioned, that have been reaching out and talking to the election commission there. But it makes it a little bit more difficult to organize, maybe from the top down, this kind of across the board effort to make sure that the entire election is going to be staged in a you know, safe and trustworthy way. And I guess Ken's asking about sort of what kind of infrastructure in the US would you, based on what you saw there, like to see people pursuing in the US to give us confidence. And I guess my other question is about technology. I mean, we saw the incredible contact tracing that Korea was able to do. We've seen it not be rolled out much in the US. But how much is the technology that was used to curb COVID going to be important to be in place and to be working, and for people to have confidence in by the time of November? Or is the contact tracing not that essential for the election holding, because you're taking people's temperatures and you're doing other kinds of tracking?
Yeah, two big, great questions. And and as you point out, this is one of the dissimilarities. You know, I mean, federalism is having a reckoning over there, and it's not looking great. Let me tell you from a distance. You know, I think that you do have to look. The situation is much more complicated, and frankly, in my own view, looking at November, dangerous, because whereas the vulnerability of the South Korean system would be if there's something wrong with or in the National Election Commission, which there has been. I mean, there's been recently documented deep state, you know, messing around with the presidential elections here. And so that's a vulnerability of the system, because it's centralized. You know, if there's a vulnerability, weakness in the center, then that affects the whole thing. But the problem in the United States is there just needs to be one state or a couple states where they're in the peak of their second wave, and they haven't done the work that would be going on now to prepare for all the contingencies of a safe election, where there's a large number of people who are disenfranchised because they're COVID positive. And the results of I mean, I can think of so many scenarios where a few states that are going to be close to begin with, you know, don't follow basic protocols, and whichever way it ends, it's seen as illegitimate, you know, by a large part of the electorate, and delegitimizes the entire election, the entire result. And so I don't, to the question, there's no, Korea, this is where it's a dissimilarity. Korea doesn't give a solution to that because it is centralized. It kind of raises the question of whether there should be a public institution, a nonpartisan, institution that nationalizes the process of elections in the United States in the future, depending on how bad November is, so that this isn't a localized issue, but can be done in a kind of rational, at a national level. Otherwise, I think that, insofar as there are specific technical things that US states could learn, I hope that learning process can happen, targeting states that are going to need the help, that they can really, actually, to the second part of your question, or your second question, Susan, about technology, there's a lot of use of technology in the contact tracing. There's also use of technology in the elections. So like they rolled out, Korea rolled out, the National Election Commission rolled out they have a new system for, with a kind of voter ID card that allows a Korean, wherever they are in the country, to use their card, be identified safely, and actually print out the ballot and vote right there. And then they also have a system of sorting and counting the ballots. They can't be hacked in. It's an entirely internal system, but it digitizes and mechanizes part of the process to make it more reliable than humans going through, and faster, and all those things. So the use of technology in South Korea is, you see it in the contact tracing. You also see it actually in the mechanics of the voting itself, of the election itself. I just keep coming back to the fact that what I think works here is because there is, it can be at the state level, but because there are public resources to do this, and that there's public trust in these institutions. It's their job. You got tons of smart people, decently paid, working hard to figure this stuff out. How are we going to do this election safely and also efficiently, and count it and make sure that there's no monkey business? That stuff has to be in place in every state in the country, and it's got to be working for the next few months, so that November, is not a constitutional electoral nightmare.
So just maybe one more question about technology, because there's a lot of issues going on right now in the U.S. about mail-in voting, about privacy. And it strikes me that, we keep coming back to this issue of public trust in institutions and public institutions. There's a lot of discussion. There are a couple of states in the U.S. that have only mail-in ballots now. And there are a lot that have mixed. There's a lot of advocacy of early voting or of absentee voting. There's a lot that's been said about whether or not that increases the ability to rig the vote in the U.S. There's secretaries of states that are working on new voting machines, changing voting machines. There's been a lot of stories from the previous midterm elections in 2018 about things that didn't go well in certain states. So it just strikes me that South Korea, in contrast to a lot of the sort of mistrust now that's built up surrounding elections and questions in the US, that number one, people wanted to vote in person. It sounds like there were not many mail-in ballots, or I'm not sure what the situation was with that in South Korea, but that would be interesting to hear your comment on. And then sort of secondly, this issue of trust in the technology. Apparently ROK voters were not worried about any reprisals they don't worry about people tracking their vote and reprisals. They trust the institutions to keep their information private, which has been a big concern, I think, in the US about sort of privacy, hacking, who has this information, how are they using it, etc. So maybe if you could just comment on that, and then maybe we'll turn to some non-election related questions. Yeah.
Well, so I think that's right. in terms of not a huge amount of mail-in voting. What my understanding, what they did here is a kind of blended approach where there are basically a lot of different ways to vote. It did include a mail-in, but that was fairly limited. For example, COVID positive patients used a very special kind of mail-in. You know, there's universal conscription here, so they always have to figure out how our soldiers going to vote.
Right.
And so they would use mail-in. I heard a thing about sailors and Korean citizens on ships. Oh, this is fantastic when you talk about technology. There's a special anonymized fax technology that they used so that ships could fax in safely their votes, people on ships. But for the majority, the vast majority of Koreans, the way it worked is there was more early voting, and a lot more people did the early voting, whereas usually it would be just the day. Now, of course, the day is a national holiday, you know, which many countries do. I mean, America's way behind the curve on that. You don't choose between work and voting. This is kind of a sacred day where just, you know, you get the day off. But there was also a lot, and companies gave a lot, and I think had to allow for employees, you know, to take the time to vote early. So there was, that was one of the big pushes. But then again, a lot of it was about all the protocols around the polling stations themselves, you know, as opposed to shifting over to mail-in. So, you know, that may or may not work. As we say, there are a lot of, you know, whatever can be inspired by Korea, great on the technical side. I mean, the United States is a very different society, and state by state, you're going to have all different kinds of issues. But they used basically this blended approach, you know, all predicated on how do we make sure everyone can vote, especially when we have a highly contagious, you know, pandemic raging, which is the same premise.
I mean, one thing we didn't really hear much about was any concern about falsification of results or interference. And probably because maybe the result wasn't that close, it didn't turn out to be a concern. But was that a concern beforehand? And are there concerns like we saw during the election in Taiwan, which really preceded COVID, but there was a lot of concern about disinformation from various social media sites, et cetera. And I know there's been a concern about North Korean hacking there. Did that emerge at all, or did that seem to not really come up because of the result?
Very little. I think that's part of it. The result, what, you know, the gap was pretty clear. But you know, this is kind of fascinating me for a while, because again, a dissimilarity has been to watch U.S. concerns about Russian interference and active Russian interference, maybe much lower level of Chinese interference, but meddling in the U.S. election, but also sort of what's the right reaction, you know, and the dangers of kind of overreacting to a fear of disinformation, where the public starts to lose faith in the whole process, and this whole kind of not knowing what to trust, almost sort of paralysis. So that, and delegitimizing the entire process, that, you know, I haven't seen any of that in South Korea. It's kind of interesting, actually, that North Korea doesn't do more. I mean, they could, if they really wanted to. They could be a lot more like Putin, I think, and mess with South Korean elections. But there's very little evidence of that and concern about that. China doesn't meddle and Russia doesn't meddle. And so far the United States doesn't meddle either. So there's not that same level of concern. There have been issues with basically domestic abuses, but there wasn't a lot of that in this election cycle.
Yeah, maybe COVID helped with that. Sort of everyone was focused on the pandemic, and
I think that's right.
It made the campaign a little bit less high profile and maybe a bit more smoothly run.
Yeah, and again, you know, it is like an American midterm election. There's not as much international profile and at stake, and but that wasn't a big issue.
All right, well, let's turn, if you don't mind. We still have about a little bit less than 20 minutes, but you're there in Seoul, and you've been there for a while. We're all stuck in our houses on this side of the Pacific. And I really would like to get your thoughts on how things look from Seoul at the moment. So President Moon has 2 more years in his term and has now control of the legislature, has a favorable sort of setup. What is it that you think he will be prioritizing, and what do you think he can get done in his next couple of years, given the incredible number of uncertainties that he and everyone is facing with COVID-19 pandemic, with the economic fallout? Obviously, the situation surrounding the U.S. election makes for some unpredictability. And then, of course, Kim Jong-un has also been, aiming some fire at the ROK recently. There's a very unpredictable situation there as well. What do you see, kind of, if we look forward from here, from President Moon's perspective?
Yeah, well, domestic politics always come first. I'll do it more quickly since probably our listeners are more interested in the foreign policy. But on the domestic front, what Moon is trying to do is to put out a picture of recovery. What is post? I mean, because it is more livable here. We're at a level of, it's surging recently. Surging in Korea means 50, 60 cases a day. I keep an eye on Sacramento because my beloved mom is there, and they're hitting 300 new cases a day. So our surge and your surge are, big difference. But that's kind of the level it's at, but there's always concern that it could suddenly spike back up. Still, there's room to imagine what does post-corona look like. And Moon has, I'd say he's already articulated the vision. It's fascinating in a way. It goes to the links with the United States. He talks about the Korean New Deal. So it's the language of FDR. There's also the Green New Deal. There's a big emphasis on, this is kind of a dry run for climate change, and the way that we're transforming our lives, forced to transform it by this pandemic. That's the scale that we have to, of transformation we have to think of. And Korea has to transform the way it does everything to get ready for climate change and mitigate it and adapt to it in advance. And there's a lot of emphasis on inequality. Now, the inequality problems in Korea are very small compared to a lot of places in the world, including compared to the United States. But you guys all saw Parasite. There is inequality here. It's a real thing. And Moon, as a classic liberal and progressive, is looking for ways to basically come out of this crisis by closing the gap even further. So a lot of the economic policy is focused on that. UBI has emerged as a major, universal basic income has emerged as a big topic of discussion here. So that's kind of what's churning in terms of, turning crisis into opportunity domestically. Foreign policy wise, I mean, so much about this, Susan, and others on this call. What I'm seeing is, what I would expect in general is that as Moon heads toward the door over the next 2 years, he's gonna look for the inner Korean breakthrough. That is the issue that he cares the most about, that would define his legacy. It defines every South Korean leader's legacy, is what did they do on that issue? So they all focus on that as they head toward the door. And even the conservatives suddenly want to talk to Pyongyang because they're trying to figure out, well, is there a Hail Mary I can do here at the end? And so I would expect Moon to do that. I wonder right now if he's getting a little impatient, because I don't think the North Koreans, you can do anything with them until after November. Right. I think they've been waiting since Hanoi to see. And if it's Trump, there'll be some kind of opportunity. And if it's Biden, it's going to be tough either way. But you reset the clock. But right now, and I can't tell, is Moon seriously trying to push on something now? He just reshuffled his team. It's a very North Korea heavy team. And I don't know if that's in anticipation. Steve Biegun is here now. I don't know if it's all in anticipation or if they're getting impatient, I can't read that from the outside, but I do think ultimately however the timing plays out and the coordination with the United States, for better or for worse, that's going to be what he wants to do.
Okay, since you mentioned the coordination with the United States, let's turn to U.S. ROK relations and how it's seen from there in Seoul, both on the part of the government, but also I'd be really curious. I mean, you have students and others at the university that you interact with sort of from average people's lens, if to the extent you can gauge it. It may be anecdotal, but how are people viewing U.S. ROK relations, and how do they see sort of the main issues that they're looking for to the U.S. on, really, for the midterm future?
You know, I would say, trying to sum it up and look back, that the underlying relationship has, from the South Korean perspective, has proven remarkably strong and resilient, because it's really been under siege, would be the South Korean perception, from the top, from President Trump himself, you know, who all you have to do is listen to what he says at a rally. And, you know, international media will usually only cover the North Korea part, but it's followed most of the time by the South Korea part, which is certainly covered here, where he says they're a bunch of free riders, you know, and we got to get our troops out of there. And, you know, basically the alliance is transactional and South Koreans are ripping us off. I mean, that's the very consistent message of the president. And we've seen that it's not just a messaging thing, you know, so a chronic kind of assault on the relationship is the negotiation of USFK, you know, which is now, as you know, most people on this call would know, is on an annual, you know, and Trump has said, get me $5 billion or else. And it's kind of a ridiculous number, you know, from a South Korean perspective. And they're sort of trying to figure out, are you guys going to accept a reasonable increase, or are we seriously having a conversation in terms of $5 billion? You know, if so still, in terms of my sense of perceptions of kind of the United States and the relationship, people here have given a lot of, you know, kind of benefit of the doubt and sort of separated this Trump phenomenon, which maybe they don't know quite how to make sense of. But I would say there's a view here that this is a gigantic mulligan, you know, in American history. And it hasn't, you know, hurt the trade relationship, the investment relationship, the military relationship. It hasn't yet done lasting damage, but it is very close. It's already close. You know, there could be Trump and, you know, could announce he's pulling out a division and start actually do that before November. If the new ICE regulations, right, go into effect, South Koreans are the third largest group of foreign students in the United States. Many of my students from here are over there. At my encouragement, you know, go study at OSU, go study at Stanford, go study at Harvard. They could be deported, essentially. You know, that's going to have a huge impact on how younger South Koreans look at the United States. So there's a lot of things that could go wrong before November. And if Trump is reelected, 4 more years of this, I don't think it can't survive intact in the same way that I do think it's actually survived 4 years of sort of siege.
I'll just pose the question that I had put up is, you know, you talked about the relations between the South Korea and the US, but what do the Korean public think about the tensions between the US and China in our relationship? And is there concern and on how that will affect them? And do they feel like it's a zero-sum game? You know, if we're having poor relations with China as our ally, they, you know, need to not continue good relations. So I'd be interested in hearing that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Susan. Elliot, hugely important question. And, you know, as an American China expert, I've found it endlessly fascinating to try to understand evolving South Korean views toward China, and as you say, toward U.S.-China relations. And they're hard to pin down. And I also find it's very hard from a public statement to know what's really going on. You know, there's still a lot of that where you need to know people and talk to them to understand how they're really viewing both sides, because there's kind of a safe public thing you say. The safe public thing that you hear kind of ad nauseum, and that at some level is true, is South Korea does not want to choose. South Korea does not want to choose between the United States and China. There's kind of, you know, no way South Korea wants to choose China over the United States. That's still, despite everything I just described, that remains kind of inconceivable. And the perception for the vast majority, I would say, of South Koreans, the perceptions of the United States have gotten more negative, but again, that's mostly an extension of this Trump phenomenon. There's still a sense of, okay, but the rest of America is not like that. Perceptions of China, just as negative or more negative. And I don't think they're as much, oh, it's just about Xi Jinping. I think there's a general sense that as China becomes wealthier and more powerful, it's becoming more of a bully, you know, and it's bullying everyone, and including South Korea. And South Korea, like everyone else, has to be ready for that and know how to manage it. And a good relationship with the United States and a strong presence of the United States in the region, obviously, that's kind of one of the first things you reach for. You got a great power over here, you look for the great power over there to balance it. And the fact that South Korea does not have a good relationship with Japan and isn't looking for a good relationship with Japan, and I would say that's vice versa, at least under the current governments, means they don't really have that option there. You know, so it's even more of a need for a strong United States. But then it's sort of, you know, the catch here is South Korea doesn't want conflict. You know, they don't want the two falling in the Thucydidean trap. Already, much of the trade war has been so negative for South Korean economic interests, you know, for companies, that they're not comfortable with that. They haven't liked that. That goes so directly against their bottom line. And so it's very, you know, I think for when I talk to Americans, I understand why they're frustrated, because it's true. South Koreans kind of want to have it both ways. They want the United States here, sort of standing up to China. On the other hand, they say, don't get into a fight with them. We need you guys to get along, you know. So it's a very complicated dynamic. One thing that's different is in the United States, maybe not in my native California, but at least in faraway Washington and New York and Maine, you can tell us, Susan, China feels much further away, you know? And so this whole discourse of decoupling, wherever you stand on that, it's imaginable for Americans. It's not imaginable for South Koreans. That's fantasy land to talk about decoupling. China is right over there. And so that's kind of not an option even to talk about that. And I think that when Americans talk about that, the more America talks about decoupling or kind of radical disengagement, the end of engagement, that's alienating. That's very hard for South Koreans to relate to, because that's so far from reality, you know, for them. And that's not just South Korea. That, I think, applies to many of the key partners and allies for the United States in the region.
Well, and would you say, because I think Susan is still having a little bit of technical difficulty, but what about economically? Because I know that must be an issue, you know, the effect of COVID on China and the trade that China and Korea have, which I know is important for Korea. Has that affected their, you know, the economic situation in Korea? And are they worried, you know, worried about that, not just from the US-China perspective, but that, you know, that's going to continue perhaps to affect, you know, the ability of the Korean economy to come back from the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's so much worries about every aspect of COVID's impact, because, you know, so far what it's done is shut down so much global trade and interaction. And South Korea is such a heavily trade dependent economy. It's the poster child, you know, of successful globalization, and it continued that right up through the pandemic. So it's hugely vulnerable to this. And you know, one of the most interesting trends going into the pandemic was, and even before, you know, this predates the trade war. This has been years in the making, and it was very interesting for me to see this trend get stronger and stronger. Is South Korea was looking, actually businesses were leading the way, looking to Southeast Asia and really strengthening the relationships with ASEAN countries. The biggest one though is Vietnam. I mean, the Korea-Vietnam link has been getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And so that was very much about, you know, there's a business logic to that in terms of China becoming a more expensive place to produce goods and a more competitive market, harder to sell goods, competing with Chinese rivals. And so that was pushing a lot of South Korean companies to Vietnam. But it was also about, you know, a general strategy. And so there's been liberal and conservative government support of limiting some of the risks of that high level of dependency and exposure to China. And then that strategy has looked even smarter as US and China trade conflict has intensified. So, you know, at this point, we're still, from a Korean perspective, to your question, Susan, too much in the thick of the pandemic. But again, in terms of this discussion about what does the post-COVID economic landscape look like, I would expect, whether, certainly if it happens under Moon or even his predecessor, Korea goes right back to that strategy, you know, and there's a smaller version of that with Europe as well, with the EU. So I do think that there's a very concerted effort to diversify away from essentially the US and China and the US-China dynamic to the South with Southeast Asia, and then kind of this Eurasian connection. And that's a big part of what South Korea, you know, will want to do after the pandemic.
It is 11 a.m. and probably midnight there. So I want to thank you, John, for really a great discussion and giving us a lot of great ideas to think about how we're going to conduct our elections and what we can learn, you know, from our friends in South Korea. And also thanks at the end for giving your thoughts on, you know, what's going on in terms of foreign policy toward the U.S. Because that's our bread and butter here at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And we look forward to having you come and speak again in the future. So thanks to you, and thanks to Susan for moderating a great discussion. And anyway, and thanks to all of you for participating. Good night, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night. Thanks so much. Thank you, Susan.